easy task for me. So, all right. My name is Christina Rosen. Some of you already know me. I am surprised to see how many folks are here this morning. So thank you for coming. I am going to put in the chat the ACA Code of Ethics because you may want to refer to those as we are in the process of going through the Code of Ethics. Now, the way I'm going to do this is hopefully will be a little bit of fun so that you guys can enjoy it and think about how you yourself maybe could maybe make some small changes so that you are taking care of what you need to take care of in your own practice. All right. All right. So our goals today will be to review the Code of Ethics, particularly related to North Carolina. And I know the board did this a little bit yesterday, but I'll explain how we're going to do it slightly different. Also to help you explore ways to avoid maybe going into these ethics by accident. I don't believe people purposely do ethical violations, although sometimes it may feel like it's personable. And then we're going to review an ethical decision-making model and encourage you to look at your own ethical decision-making model. And we'll do this from the counselor's viewpoint, student viewpoint, and supervisor viewpoint. All right, learning objectives, there they are. All right, so let's get into the meat of this. So yesterday, the board was talking about their highest complaints, which is different than what we're looking at when we're looking at actual violations. And so as we go through this PowerPoint, keep in mind that when I'm talking about actual violations, I'm talking about any violation that was recorded on a complaint. So some complaints, and we'll talk about this a bit more, have up to like 16 violations on one complaint or on one action or on one decision that was made in regards to the board. I have to give my GA a pat on the back. He went through every single public record that was available on the North Carolina Board of Licensed Clinical Mental Health Counselors. And so he's the one that helped me collect this data. And so Ethan has done a great job in helping me get ready. Okay, so the board said some of the highest, one of the most common complaints was high divorce complaints. Well, let's break that down for a little bit. If we're looking at the Code of Ethics, both 2009 and 2014, we can see that it's not just one code that was possibly violated under that umbrella. Ethical boundaries, I only put one code down there, but as we unpack this, you will begin to see that ethical boundaries are throughout the Code of Ethics. And so there's really a lot more codes that I could have put on there. Same with record keeping. So record keeping, when we look at the Code of Ethics, is across many of the sections of the Code of Ethics. Intimate relationships, they are also across the Code of Ethics. And later I break all that down for you, but just to give you a sense that when we're talking in broad terms, we are talking about how it affects all of the Code of Ethics, not just one particular Code of Ethics. And so what I've done is I've looked at the Code of Ethics only in North Carolina to see which specific section and which specific Code of Ethics has the most violations. And under section A, 1AB has accumulated 22 separate violations. So record keeping and documentation is one of the highest in North Carolina if we're only looking at 1AB, okay? When we move down further, you'll see how maybe across the code of ethics that shifts a little bit. And then, of course, confidentiality came in with 17 complaints, and avoiding harm had 17 complaints. So I think we have a little bit of work to do with documentation. And I see some of my formal students are on, and as they know, I always say, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So if you can't prove something by showing the documentation of it, then that in itself could be a breach of the code of ethics. And I'm not great at documentation, and we all probably have room to grow in documentations, but keep that in mind. And sorry, I always lose my voice about this time of year. All right, so which counselor development stage has the most violations or complaints? And if you can, I prefer the chat, but I know they want you to use the app. So you can do either one. Which do you think it's students? Do you think it is restricted license folks? Do you think it's people who are newly unrestricted from 2 to 5? Do you think it's people from 5 to 15? Or do you think it's people 15 to and above? Who has the most violations as experience goes? Who do you think? Okay. All right. All right. A lot of people are saying 15 years and above. No, the common violations are not in the order of frequency. That's why I have the number about how often they actually occurred. So that's the number of times that code has been violated. All right, so for those of you who said 15 and above, you are correct. The majority of the violations. Now, I don't know about in North Carolina specifically, but I do know nationally the whoops, what happened here? Yeah, nationally, the most violations are by what we considered experts and unrestricted license. The most of those are 15 years or greater. Also, the second group is 10 to 15 years. So we might be asking ourselves, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, except for a lot of times as we get more mature in our field, we may either take for granted information that we think we know, or we may end up doing things automatically. So one of the things that I wanted, before we get into this too far, I want us to recognize and remember that this is only on from here on out, North Carolina Board public records that I had access to, or Ethan had access to. And so we reviewed physical copies of 113 different records that we could download and review, and he read every single one of those. He's in his ethics class this semester, so I think he feels like he's already finished ethics, but he hasn't. So out of the 113 records, there were 330 violations. So a record, and you'll see this in a few minutes, can have more than one violation, which is why we have 330 violations. And then in North Carolina, according to a board member, there's over 11,000 counselors. So you may be thinking, well, if there's only 113 records, then that means there's, the percentage is pretty low. Well, in theory, that might be true, except for, remember, I'm only reviewing the records from 2006 to 2022 because that's what's available to me. And we're only reviewing the records that are available to me. So if we think about the process, there's probably more violations than I'm aware of because they're not public records yet. Okay, so during the next 5 slides, I would like you to ask yourself, grab a piece of paper and ask yourself, how do you see yourself slipping into some of these situations? I know we like to think we wouldn't have an ethical violations, but you know, the reality is we're all human and we can all goof up here and there. So try to be thinking about how you might be able to see yourself in these situations. Because I really don't think people wake up and say, oh, today I'm going to have an ethical violation. All right, so here are some of, this is the accumulation of the record that Ethan was able to go through and find. So in 2006, so that's the first time we have the public records, there were 4 recorded violations, and each one of them either had 1 or 6 episodes or 6 different violations. In 2008, we had 5, and they either had 1 ethical violation up to 3. In 2009, now remember in 2009, the board changed some of its laws and some of its rules. And so during that year, we only had 3 recorded complaints, and there was only 1 violation for each one of them. However, look what happens between 2010 to 2014. We slowly increase our numbers until 2013 of violations. And in 2012, we had 1 complaint that had up to 9 different violations. And in 2014, we had 1 complaint that had up to 11 different violations. Now, imagine that. How does that happen? Well, again, the Code of Ethics are not just 1 section. There's a lot, they're integrated in a lot of different ways. So if we're only reading and paying attention to 1 section, it's really easy to violate all these other sections. So also in 2015, we had 12 recorded events with up to 5. In 2018, we had 16 recorded events, up to 18 different violations. And then as you notice, we start declining. The other thing to remember is we know that it can take up to 10 years for new ethical codes and legal regulations to come into existence with the field. And so as a counselor educator at Appalachia State, a lot of times my alumni, I arrived at 2007, would come back from a site in 2010 or 2011 and say, da, 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 da. And it's like, well, according to the 2014 Code of Ethics, you can't do that. Or according to the 2009 regulations of the North Carolina board, that can't happen. So then I would be talking to agencies or sites to help educate them, because sometimes we don't know that we don't know, because we can't know that we don't know because we don't know, which is a favorite thing that I love to say to my classes, because people forget that sometimes we just don't know and we sit on what we used to know. So here's a greater breakdown, and ask yourself, can you see yourself doing this? So in section A, which is the counseling, in all the sections, the biggest section that has the most complaint is section A. 190 complaints have been related to, there's been 190 violations in section A across the 113 complaints or complaints. So that's 50% of all the violations, and that is the counseling relationship. Now, in a few minutes, we'll break that down so you can see how that also includes records and other important aspects. But just sit with that for a minute. 190 times Section A has been violated. So we still have work to do to help people understand Section A in North Carolina. And so this is like 58%. So the orange is the actual number, and then this is the percentage. The next highest section is Section B, and that is the confidentiality and privacy. And then we go into Section C, which is personal responsibility. And then D, which is relationship. B and C are actually one number apart. B has 50 different violations documented, and then C has 49. So out of the 113 complaints, 50 times B was cited and 49 times C was cited. And then we tend to progress a little bit, but E and I are also very close to each other. E has 18 different times that that section has been identified as being violated. Out of the 100 went across the 113 complaints. And then in I, you have—
Dr. Rosen,
yes?
We have a question in the chat. I'm trying to help you watch. Someone is asking for how many years, 2006 to 2022?
Yes. Yep. This data is only between 2006 and 2022. So that's about 16 years. Thank you for letting me know, because I forget about the chat. Okay, and then in Section I is 11. And remember, in 2006, we did not have the new laws and regulations because North Carolina changed laws and regulations in 2009, and we were under the 2009 ACA Code of Ethics. And I took that into consideration when I was looking at, as much as I could, when I was looking at this. Okay, so specific codes, and this might be where you want to grab your ACA Code of Ethics. U1A is, I put these in order so that if you're looking at the Code of Ethics, you could see it. 1A is primary responsibility. 1A1B is record and documentation. So out of Section A, the biggest one that was reported as being a problem was the records and documentation. So that goes back to, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And then and then we're looking at the next highest, which is A4, and that is avoiding harm. And I just realized you guys can't see my, okay, that's avoiding harm. So 17 times someone complained and was deemed violating this section of the Code of Ethics.
And we have another question to verify what,
thank you.
Just for verification, are these complaints or the ones that are ruled as valid?
So these are the complaints and with the end results of indicating that there was a violation. So we have not doubled up on them. So they are complaints. Let me say that different. They are complaints. And what I didn't do is go through and analyze how many of the complaints were all the complaints were heard by the board. So these are the complaints that were heard by the board, and there was some kind of outcome regarding that complaint. What I didn't do for the sake of time, because we only have an hour, is go through and indicate how many specific complaints were ended in a sanction of some sort how many of those complaints ended up in a sanction to the counselor. Because I just wanted you to see how the slope can happen, how we can easily start having complaints by clients, because remember, perception happens, or complaints by professionals. Because once a complaint is to the board, then the board has to hear those complaints. And then if you notice, A5 is sexual relationships, and those is very close to A4, and A5 sexual relationships have a total of, wait a minute, I lost my notes here. A5 has a total of 20% of the complaints stating that was violated. So in this, we are seeing that still under the category of counseling relationships, there's still a lot of violations, even though some of those are related to documentation. All right, Section B, confidentiality and privacy. I broke these out this way because I thought it would be easier to see Section B. So records and documentations on Section B, we can see that the subcodes that have been also indicated in those complaints as being violated are 17 with B6A, which is creating and maintaining records and documentation. So if it hasn't happened, if it's not in writing, it hasn't happened. And then in E is the next one that has 2 complaints. And that one is, I don't have that one written down in my notes. So sorry about that. B1 is the second one that has the highest, which is respecting clients' rights. And then B5, client lacking capacity to give informed consent. So this often is dealing with children or dealing with adults that are not able to give informed consent for one reason or another. Section C is professional relationships, and that includes the knowledge of compliance and standards, which is only 2%. However, 47% is professional competencies. And under that, C2G, it has 10 recorded complaints stating that counselor impairment was violated. So out of this category, nearly half of the reported complaints and seen as violations is counselor impairment. So this morning, Richard Yepp's conversation webinar about self-care, we need to do a better job of helping ourselves take care of ourselves. The other high, oh, I'm sorry, I was in the wrong, yeah, I'm okay. I'm keeping myself straight. All right, and then advertisement has 8%, and then the other is professional qualifications. But then let's look at public responsibility. C6 includes such things as reporting to insurance or courts. And one of the violations with C6 was people reporting, giving diagnoses to spouses or to parents, and they had not performed a correct diagnostic assessment. We may be trying to be kind and help clients, but we need to be careful in how we're reporting things. Also, this includes insurance fraud. With reporting the wrong diagnosis or reporting a diagnosis that is not valid or proper. Section D is a relationship with other professionals. And as you notice, this one, although a lot of them in this section has had complaints, this one is a little bit smaller. There's only 9. And the one that is has the most problems is establishing professional and ethical obligations. And then this one we put together, I just put all in the same one. I highlighted the decision-making model because we are going to be talking about that. But if we notice that sexual relationship is also in section F, and there was at least 1 reported there. And then we have working with friends, family and friends, and supervisors and teachers. You know, we're not allowed to have sexual relationships with our students or their family members. And we're not allowed to be training friends and family. And so we need to be careful that we're also checking ourselves. And we can't have sexual relationships with our supervisees, family members either. So as I tell my class, don't have sex with your client's families or your client's significant others, because that's still an issue. We're still doing it. So we've got to be careful in how we do that. Okay, disclaimer, I'm not an attorney and I'm not on any of the licensure boards, nor have I ever been an attorney or on any of the licensure board. I know some of you are thinking this is kind of quirky. I hope my alumni are laughing, or if any of my students are on here are laughing. But the reason that I say this is because just by me giving this presentation, particularly as I move further into the presentation, I could be sued giving this presentation if you see what I'm telling you as me giving you legal or ethical advice. What I'm giving you is the information that I have learned in the field through my research of understanding ethics and understanding as a supervisor, both as a counselor educator and the alumni supervision I do. I stay up to date on ethics and legal processes. And so this is what I know, but by no means, this is not advice. All right. I want you to think about yourself. Now, I asked you to think about, could you see yourself in any of those ethic codes? Well, how do people slip into the slope of ethics? How do we lose our true north? I don't know about you guys, but this pandemic sure has turned my life upside down. And although I would have liked to have had more rest during the pandemic, probably like you guys, I haven't had a lot of extra rest, even if I'm doing my best to take care of myself. So I know for me, when I'm tired or when I am having a physical ailment, I need to take extra care of myself. And think about, how do we start losing that ethical compass that we have? Do we sometimes, we're so much in a hurry that we do what seems easy? Is it sometimes we do what's easy because we don't have the energy or we're juggling too much? I know for me, I have a little warning bell when I like someone or like just taking the easy way out, that goes off for me, that says, oh, you need to consult on this. You need to use your ethical decision-making model. Because when we don't, that's when we will slip into that doing one small thing that then we justify, that then can lead to other slips. And I know in the field for a while, we used to say, well, it depends. And some of that can be true. However, if you're thinking to yourself, it can depend, then are you consulting with someone to make sure that it actually can depend? ACA a couple years ago came out to our conference, and the people who actually helped develop the 2014 Code of Ethics were correcting some of our understandings of the Code of Ethics. So do you actually know what you think you know? Are you consulting? Are you reaching out to people? Have you made assumptions about some of the Code of Ethics? Do you go back to the Code of Ethics and recognize that those are references and you don't have them memorized? Are you sometimes on the edge of impairment and you're not backing off the edge and doing some of the things that you need to do to take care of yourself? Are you sometimes trying to be too nice? Are you thinking, well, I know this person, so this time we can do X, Y, Z? Because as soon as you do that, then you're breaking your own policies. And if you're breaking your own policies, have you written down the reason for breaking those policies? And they told me to, that should be 1O, is not a reason to break a code of ethics. We have a code of ethics that says we're knowledgeable about our code of ethics and we're knowledgeable about our state legal regulations. So they told me to is not a good defense. So here is, I like Wheeler and Bertram's books. Every time Wheeler has a new book out, I'm reading it because I think she helps me, keeps my my true north compass in alignment. And so some of the things that she recommends is, do you have a risk management toolkit? How often are you consulting with colleagues? Have you read your informed consent as if you were a client? Are those definitions clear? Do you know that your clients actually understand your informed consent? Are you asking them how they understand your informed consent? Our professional disclosure statement, the board uses that to help determine if the client was informed about your practice, your policies, and your operation. And so if your informed consent says one thing, I mean, if your professional disclosure statement says one thing and you do the opposite, you set yourself up for a complaint, and then you set yourself up for that complaint to be reviewed as a violation. So think about that. I will have alumni periodically email me and say, well, will you look at my informed consent? It might be helpful to ask a colleague to look at your informed consent. You might even want to ask your clients periodically, how do you understand my professional disclosure statement? Also, you might want to ask yourself, are you actually reviewing it verbally with your clients? Are you just assuming every client reads and understands the informed consent? And let's be honest, how many of us go into the doctor's office and just sign? We don't actually read the whole informed consent. So be thinking about how you do that. Institutional policies. Do you have your own agency policies? If you're in private practice, do you actually have a folder, digital or a hard binder that has your policies in them that says your working hours are da 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 da, and you are doing such and such, and you have this agreement and you have that agreement, so that you're following your own policies. So that if you do an exception to your own policies, then you can document why, which policy. And so if you are reported, then you have the documentation ready for the board. If you're keeping it in your head, then remember, one of the highest violations is documentation. So have it in your head is not sufficient. Terminations and abandonment. How are you talking about when sessions will end? Do you have a treatment plan? How are you talking about when you need to make a referral? Are you including the client in that process, in that conversation? How do you document your own clinical decision-making model or your own ethical decision-making model? Do you have one written out? Or do you just do it from your head? Ways to avoid. Document all your decision-making process. My students and my alumni and people that I consult with probably get annoyed with me because I always say, now make sure you document this conversation that we had. Did you document that text that you got from the client? Where is that text being housed in the documentation for your client? Now, where is that email being housed in the documentation of the client? How are you protecting that documentation? Same with the decision-making model. The one that I'm going to show you is an 8-point model. And if you actually have it written out, you can write how you took each one of those steps in making the decision-making. You know, the older we're in the field, the more things start to feel like they're the back of our hands. And I notice we only have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to move a little bit closer through this. Supervisors, are you making sure you're staying competent and your supervisees are staying competent? Supervisors, do you have your own professional liability insurance? Are you documenting your professional organization memberships? And how are you keeping track of the CEs that you're going to? Here's some of the management toolkit. It's right out of Wheeler and Bertram's book. They suggest having it all in one location. Do you have all of this in a binder and have you read it? Do you have a subpoena checklist? Do you know how to actually respond to the subpoena? Do you have an attorney and other professional contact, or are you waiting until that suit or that complaint happens to get an attorney? Are you annually reviewing your documents to make sure they're appropriate and up to date? Some of this we've already gone through. Ask yourself, are you really doing these things? Or are you just mentally doing these things? Are you document that you have actually sat down and done these? What about, are you clear about your social presence? and how you're going to interact with the clients. It's not good and it's not sufficient enough to say, I just don't, because it's not really against our code of ethics. What's against our code of ethics is recognizing that social media presence can create dual or multiple relationships. So then how are you going to handle that? And what's your rationale for doing that? If you're in private practice, do you have your hours set up? Do you have a way to remind your clients of your hours now that you're doing telemental health? Are you violating your own boundaries of your office hours? Are you occasionally answering emails outside of your office hours? Remember, as soon as you do that, you will begin to set the client up to believe that you do that on a regular basis. So be real careful with your own boundaries if you're in private practice. All right, institutional policies, know your own, know the institution. Remember, once you're an employee, you are saying that you have agreed to these policies. Once you start your own agency, you're saying you agree to those policies. Have somebody review those with you. Have a third person look at those policies with you to make sure they're clear. Remember, you want to prevent harm to clients. So your first thought is always to prevent harm to clients. So the more clear you are and the more the clients understand it, the less likely you're going to create harm. And then here are some other things to remember. Sometimes part of our regular relationships, like mine, sometimes I'm a professor and I'm an advisor and I'm the GA supervisor. So I have to talk about that with my clients. If your role is not clear with your clients and you're in a situation where you may have to be in two separate roles with your clients, then you can create harm with your client. So be very clear about those roles. Supervisors, be very clear. If you're an administrative supervisor and a clinical supervisor, be very clear which hat you have on in that moment when you're talking to your supervisee, because that can get you in trouble as well. Supervisor, here are some things. I am more than happy to send my PowerPoint out to you all. If you send me an email, I'll be happy to do that, or I'll find a way to upload it so that you guys can see the PowerPoint. Personal liability insurance, make sure you have your own liability insurance. The agency's liability insurance is not enough to cover you. Make sure your liability insurance covers your attorney fees. Have an attorney before you suddenly need one, and demonstrate how you are adhering to the code of ethics. All right, ethical decision-making model. I'm sorry, I put too many things into this. So Wheeler's and Bertram is the ethical decision-making model I like the most, because it helps you define the problems. It helps you identify the relevant variables that are going on. It helps you review. It requires you to review the law and the code of ethics. And then it helps you to take a look at what are any personal influences. Are you engaging with colleagues to help consult? Are you looking at talking with the supervisor? Those of us who've been in the field for 15 years or plus, we forget we need our own supervision with someone who can tell us honestly what's going on. Obtain an outside perspective on things, but make sure it's clear what you're wanting from them. Make sure you understand the consequences, intentional and unintentional consequences. Decide on the action that you're going to take, and then sit on it, and then think about it again, and then be prepared that once you take that action, that there's going to be things that you need to reconsider. Which is why you need to sit on it. And then, of course, document it. All right, so we're up to wrap up, but I want to leave room for questions. So these are really just reminders. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can